Now, my next guest is a British broadcaster and commentator, and he recently took part in an Oxford Union debate arguing against the motion this House believes Israel is an apartheid state responsible for genocide. And it didn't take long for the students to disgrace themselves.
I might just say that I understand there are plenty of people in this room who don't agree with us, who don't like us. But this esteemed establishment is meant to be a bastion of free speech, discussion and debate. And this example is not any of those things. To shout like that, to abuse a speaker who is being respectful and giving you their side of an argument is not the way to achieve better knowledge or understanding of anything.
That was Jonathan Sacerdoti, and he joins me now. Jonathan, you're an Oxford man yourself. How shocked were you by the hostility, the intolerance you faced while arguing against that absurd motion that Israel is an apartheid state and responsible for genocide?
Obviously, it was a preposterous motion. It's like asking someone to debate whether they raped and abused their wife. But that aside, I was surprised by the outrageous behaviour, not just of the audience there who seemed to have been handpicked to cause trouble and to stop us from speaking, but also by the organisers who had done everything they could to make sure that our reception was unpleasant and frosty. They refused to even carry out the traditional photograph of all the speakers at the beginning of the debate. At the dinner they held before it, apparently they meant to invite you to this dinner. They snubbed us, barely spoke to us. So I think it was clear it was more Mean Girls than Brideshead Revisited when I went to Oxford to return for that debate.
Yeah, it did seem to be a bit of a stitch-up all around, and you said there was a fair bit of deception and dishonesty behind the planning and the run-up to the debate. You were personally abused. There was some shrieking woman I heard on the tape who called you genocidal and other words I can't repeat here. Where does this deep hatred, this deep-seated hatred for Israel, for Zionism come from? And is it just anti-Semitism dressed up in a more acceptable name?
I think there were a few things at play here. One was the inability of the students in that room to even engage in a civilised and informed debate. So regardless of the subject, it was clear that their minds weren't open. And that's what I said to them in that clip that you played there, that even if you invite somebody to debate something that you disagree with them on, you maybe don't even like them based on their opinions, but you should listen to what they have to say. That's the whole point of being in a university. That's the point of debating as an activity. It's so that you can hear arguments on both sides and make up your mind, perhaps educate yourself or inform yourself, or even disagree. But none of that was done respectfully. And I think that those students there were viciously anti-Israel, in my opinion, because they were anti-Semitic predominantly. They jeered when I talked about anti-Semitism, when I talked about my late father's experience in Italy growing up during the Holocaust. He was hidden from the Nazis by Catholics, by nuns who kept him in a Catholic orphanage for 9 months, and that's why he survived the war. They rolled their eyes when I told that story, and generally they were utterly dismissive of not just the arguments in defense of Israel, the only Jewish state in the world, but also anything one said about being Jewish and the horrific atrocities that were carried out on October the 7th, which I pointed out to them actually were a genocide. What Hamas and the Palestinian terrorists did on that day in 2023 was textbook case of genocide. They launched this indiscriminate attack on mostly civilians, killing, raping, torturing and kidnapping them in order to try to diminish the Jewish population of Israel. They shouted as they did it that they were doing this for jihad and that they didn't mind dying in the service of the Nation of Islam. So I think it's a pretty clear-cut case of genocide in that instance.
And it was pretty shocking through that debate. One of the people arguing against the motion, along with yourself, asked if you were aware of October 7 being planned, would you have alerted authorities? And only around, I think, 5% of students put up their hand and said, yes, they would have alerted authorities, knowing full well that women were raped, children were murdered, just the absolute depravity that took place that day. Now, let's talk about what's happened in the last couple of days, the groundbreaking announcement from President Trump after his meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Explain to me why you believe this is a seismic shift that will redefine the Middle East.
I wrote about this in my column in The Spectator here in the UK, and I think that this is a disruption of long-entrenched failed orthodoxies, and it was Trump unveiling a vision that dared to reimagine the Middle East in completely new ways. Along with Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, the two of them showed that the region can break free of these decades of confusion and violence which has been perpetuated by Palestinian rejectionism. It has been decades that world leaders have clung to these exhausted formulas, peace processes built on illusions and agreements predicated on fantasy, and generally a willful refusal to acknowledge the fundamental realities of Palestinian rejection of an Israeli Jewish state. I think that everybody knows if there was the prospect of a Palestinian leadership that could create a state and live side by side with Israelis, with Jews in the Middle East, then that would have happened long ago. But it's very clear that that's never been the agenda of mainstream Palestinian leaders and politicians. And that, of course, all came to a head on October the 7th. So I think what Donald Trump has done in expressing a desire to permanently change that situation in Gaza, and indeed in rejecting the very concept of a two-state fantasy, is entirely valid. And I think that the rest of the world's got to catch up with his thinking on this one.
And Donald Trump hasn't just rejected the two-state fantasy, he's completely rejected the UN and its bias in this area. He has pulled the US out of the UN Human Rights Council. He's cut funding to UNRWA. He wants a review of UNESCO. Again, this is a dramatic departure from what we've seen in the past, Jonathan.
That's right. He used another executive order to give this forceful rejection of those long-standing UN biases against Israel. He removed the financial and diplomatic support from institutions that have systematically worked against Israel's legitimacy on the world stage. And the UN really has been doing that. The UN has been effectively bolstering and supporting terrorism among the Palestinians. So he cut all US funding to UNRWA, citing its infiltration by designated terrorist groups. We've seen those links with Hamas. We've seen that it's been corrupted by Hamas and other groups from October the 7th and beyond. And he also made sure that the US withdrew from the Human Rights Council, which Israel has now done as well, because that council seems obsessed with persecuting Israel. It has a permanent agenda item, which is to attack Israel. No other state in the entire world has that status, only Israel. So it's blindingly obvious to anyone that looks at it that this is a UN body which is designed not to protect human rights, but actually to attack Israel as some sort of human rights abuser, worse than any other state on the entire planet. It's quite ridiculous. And I think that Trump has done an amazing thing in signaling to the world that, you know, the leader of the free world, that America, at least under his leadership, is not going to put up any longer with that kind of UN activity. Even the UNESCO, which is meant to look after culture, has been actively working against Israel by trying to disassociate Jewish Israeli history from places like the Temple Mount and the Western Wall.
Jonathan Sacerdoti, thank you so much for your time this evening.